And with that, let me say a hearty welcome to Naomi Shihab and Danusha Lamaris. We're so honored to have you both here. Naomi Shihab is a poet, an editor, a songwriter, and a novelist. Born of Palestinian father and an American mother, she began composing her first poetry at the age of 6. And if you're like me, Naomi's poems always make me cry. I don't know what she does, but there's just like some special key that unlocks my tears. If you haven't read some of her poetry, may I recommend Gate A4 or Kindness as 2 places to start. Those are particular favorites. And you can find many of Naomi's books in this link here at bookshop.org or wherever you find excellent books. And when I asked Naomi, who would you like to talk to when we're engaging a big conversation like The Art of Listening, she said, well, I absolutely want to talk to my friend Danusha Lamaris. So we're thrilled that Danusha is here as well, a fellow poet, also a teacher and an essayist. Born to a Dutch father, just like me, and a mother from Barbados. Her poetry has that same magical quality of cultivating presence and kind of noticing the sacred in the everyday. That's what I felt as I was reading Danusha's work. And if there's another kind of entry path that I might suggest, check out Small Kindnesses and Inshallah, which I just thought were fabulous poems that really resonated with today's themes as well. And you can find Danusha's books at this link here if you're eager to check it out. So for those of you just joining, just a reminder to keep your microphones on mute, and we'll have a couple of questions for our guests. We'll read some poems, and we'll then have some time for questions at the end as well. So welcome. And Naomi and Danusha, I want to ask you, just as we get started in this very broad theme, what does listening, the practice of listening, help you do as a poet? How do you practice listening as you create these magical word conglomerations that you do in your poetry? And Naomi, perhaps I can start with you.
Thank you so much for your welcome, Casper. I really am touched by your kindness and your enthusiasm, and thank you for being so excited about inviting Danusha. I knew that you were someone I wanted to work with because you were so open to my preference of a poet to be linked up with tonight and talking about William Merwin, a very precious thing for both of us. And good evening, everybody in all your wonderful places. Some places it's snowing. I wish you peace and joy in your places, and we're all kind of anxious for tomorrow. So it's great to be here together tonight. Today I went deep, deep, Casper, into my memory, thinking about those early days when I first fell in love with poetry. And my husband and I have just finished watching, although it finished up taping a few years ago, I think, a year ago maybe, the Dickinson series on Apple TV, which really carried me back to my childhood. I do think it's the best TV series I've ever seen in my life about Emily Dickinson and her family. I strongly recommend it. But Emily Dickinson was one of the first poets I fell in love with. So I felt as if watching that show and then later going to Amherst and touring her home and her brother's home and going to the cemetery and going to many of the places that came up in the show, I felt as if it all took me back to the source of my earliest listening. And one thing I remember is that after hearing my mother read an Emily Dickinson poem to me at bedtime, say, which is where I first fell in love with her before I could read, I would feel as if the air around the poem, after the poem, had changed. The air in my little tiny bedroom had changed. And there was a richer quality to the air because there were interesting words floating around in it. Of course, I didn't understand all the words. I mean, no one would presume to completely grasp Emily Dickinson's poems at any age. I don't even now. And yet I could bask in her syntax, her phrases, her her questions, just what she brought into the room. So for me, that sense of listening to the poem, but then listening to how everything had changed afterwards was really my first um, feeling of what poetry could do in a life. And that excited me so much, just to want to be with words that were different from daily conversation.
Oh, that's beautifully said. And it makes me think about, when you enter into a place and you can just feel, maybe through the prayers or the songs or something in that place, for good and for bad, that you feel that the air is different, exactly as
Yeah.
you've said. That's beautiful.
Yes, you do often feel it in a sanctuary or in a holy place, even if it is not your preferred holy place. It doesn't matter. It's as if whatever words have been brought forth in that place before you were even there are still hovering. And so it's a calmer place, a deeper place.
Um, Danusha, I want to bring you in as quickly as possible. So tell us, how do you think about this practice of listening and the poetry that you create?
Uh, well, first of all, I just also want to say thank you so much for holding this space for people to listen deeply to one another and to share in this kind of contemplation. I think this is one of the most miraculous and marvelous things that we can be doing right now in the madness of the world. And so thank you everybody for showing up for that. And when I thought about deep listening, the word that came to mind for me of all things was eavesdropping. And of how much we love to eavesdrop. We love to overhear things. It's just in our nature. And I think in a lot of ways, writing is about eavesdropping on the world and on ourselves. I learned to, I'm still learning to notice the stories that cycle through my mind and go, because we tell the same stories often, or our family does over and over, and we think nothing of them. But there's probably something in those stories that we repeat. And so I learned to eavesdrop on myself telling those stories, or on my family members telling them again and again. And sometimes people sitting at another table, at a cafe, what are they talking about? What's going on over there? And under that same kind of umbrella, I thought, well, what are the most interesting things I have eavesdropped on? And what came to mind was not what you'd expect. I have heard some interesting conversations, but what came to my mind was sitting on the sort of in the front door of my house. I lived in a little barn up until last year, out on a few acres. And I was sitting there knowing that there was a bird's nest, a newish nest up behind the front, the porch light. And I sat there and I could hear the smallest sound, almost like a little tinkling sound, almost like the rain today. It's just lightly drizzling. And I wondered, could those be the birds about to hatch from the eggs that are in that nest? And it was almost not a sound. It was so small. And when they started poking their little heads up and peeping within the next couple of days, I realized that's what that sound had been, almost like just one fingernail tapping, And I thought, how magical that these things are happening around us all the time. Birds are hatching from their nest. Caterpillars are chewing slowly along leaves. So much is going on in the world. And writing for me is sort of the occasion to listen. It gives me an excuse and a reason to lean in and go, are those the birds just starting to hatch? Let me pay attention.
Mm.
Mm.
That's so beautiful, Danusha, and I love the tininess of it. So many people are often seeming to be waiting for something spectacular or dramatic or, kind of earth shaking, worth listening to. But I think the poet develops an aptitude or a pleasure in the tiniest things, the things that would go unnoticed, unheard, missed. A wonderful poet and painter in Florida named Sean Sexton said to me about a year or two ago, stay vigilant in this slender moment. And I wrote it on a little piece of handmade paper and have kept it in front of me ever since. And he was referring to a particular slender moment, but really every moment is a slender moment. And it's such a beautiful reminder to hold that. And if you're feeling a terrible ache or a huge emptiness, go to a place where you might be vigilant in a different way. I love what you said about eavesdropping on ourselves and on the world. Now, everyone who's on this call tonight knows why I wanted you to be here, because
Oh.
you say those things that make us see everything refreshed in a new, wonderful way. That's so beautiful.
Thank you, Naomi. I'm going to carry that slender moment with me now. Stay vigilant in this slender
moment.
And
Yeah.
all moments are slender.
Yes, they're all slender.
They're all
They're
slender.
all passing. Yes.
Yeah, I think about that a lot. They only, no matter how difficult a time we're in our lives, or how wonderful a time we're in our lives, or both, the moments are the same size.
Wow, I love
They're
that.
so
I'm writing it down.
small, you know, so they
Can I ask?
change.
Can I ask you about that, Danusha? Because one of my favorite poets, Stephen Sondheim, has in his wonderful music Into the Woods, that wonderful line that the baker's wife sings, if life were made of moments, even now and then a bad one, but if life were only made of moments, you would never know you'd had one. And so there's something about this rhythm, life is just those moments, but we can't live there all the time. We have to pick up the kids or do our taxes, or and maybe some Buddha somewhere, some guru can live in that state of moments. I know I can't, or at least I haven't yet. Maybe that's where I'm heading. But how do you navigate that in your own life as you're a poet, but you're also a person beyond that craft? How does this inform your everyday?
Do you want me to address that? And then I'd love to hear Naomi too. I realized when I was in a very difficult time in my life, where I would dread a lot of visits to the hospital and things, where I was very, I felt very weighted by the day-to-day. I came up with something that is also very small, and I don't know if it always worked. I don't want to make this sound too facile, but I would just ask that something unexpected would happen, and even maybe wonderful. Something unexpected and maybe wonderful. Because I realized what was so terrifying was the thought that all the days would be the same. And that the difficulty would always be at the same level of difficulty. But when I had that little, it was kind of a prayer or a little mantra, however you want to hold it, but let something unexpected happen. Let me be aware of it. And maybe even wonderful. Things happened. Like once when I was in a waiting room, awaiting maybe bad news, just worried, a woman turned to me and said, I feel like we know each other. And we started talking, and I said, I feel that way too. And then she just said, can I hug you? Can we just hug for a while? I mean, it was just, that is so small. But I thought, that was wonderful and really unexpected.
Yeah.
And
Really,
not so small at all. Yeah.
maybe not so small at all. And a friend of mine said that little wish before going to the doctor to have a needle put in her throat. You can imagine how excited she was about that, to test her thyroid. And the doctor said, "What do you do?" She said, "I write poetry." He said, "Oh, I love to memorize poems, specifically Shakespeare's sonnets. Would you like me to do that during the procedure?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Do you prefer English or Italian?" And so he recited Shakespearean sonnets to her in Italian while
Wow.
doing the procedure.
Well,
I love that.
and what you suggest, Danusha, when you say let something unexpected happen, I mean, that's what's happening when we really listen. We're opening ourselves, we're becoming a neutral space ourselves for something to come in and be given to us. If we're all caught up in our to-do list or where we're going next or what we're up to, sometimes we can't hear that. But when you pause, my answer to Casper's question would be trying to find that. I wrote about it in the introduction to a book called Voices in the Air, what they call in Japan, yutori, life space, finding a little space around all of the movements and all of the activities and the necessaries. Where will you pause to allow something unexpected to come into your space? And it doesn't have to be like an hour-long pause. It could be a 3-minute pause, a 1-minute pause. And that's one of the pleasures of, I think, this kind of vigilance in the slender moment, is you realize that it could be a very thin bit of time that somehow um, transforms the rest of your time.
I'm taking notes here, Naomi.
I'm taking notes. Look, I wrote all over a whole page already. Only things you said. And by the way, I do think that is the best practice for the listener. And I always have told this to kids or adults of any age, just get in the habit of writing things down. We think we'll remember them. We won't. Just write them down. Give yourself a break. And you can go back and find them when you need them. And, always have little pieces of scrap paper to write on.
Yeah,
William Irwin, by the way, as many people will already know, wrote his rough drafts of his poems handwritten on the backs of junk mail envelopes, because he
wow.
didn't want there to be anything precious about the paper he was using, and he would therefore feel free to throw it away if he chose to.
I love that.
Yeah.
Well,
These
before
technologies, we can just
exactly.
write things down.
Yeah.
Just write
Little
it down.
things. Right.
I know we're going to make our way to Moen, but we'd love to hear some of your poetry. So Naomi, I'm wondering if you would read us a poem that relates to this theme of the art of listening.
Sure.
And I'll invite, just as we do that, for folks who are listening in, if you're anything like me, your mind will still be racing all over the place. So if you want to just take a deep breath, and if you want to close your eyes, just take a stretch so we can really take in Naomi and Danusha's beautiful words. I'll invite you just to do that now.
Thank you. Well, I'll read a poem called Storyteller, which is remembering way, way back to my father telling us old Palestinian stories at bedtime, folk tales, and stories he might repeat, but always change as well. And I think he put many of his family members in them. Where is the door to the story? Is the door left open? When he sat by our beds, the day rushed past like water. Driftwood, bricks, heavy cargoes disappearing downstream. No matter, no matter. Even the trees outside our screens tipped their cooling leaves to listen. We swam so easily to the stone village, women in thick dresses, men with smoky breath, sat around the fire, pitching in our own twigs. The world curled around us, sizzled and popped. We dropped our troubles into the lap of the storyteller, and they turned into someone else's. I still try to hear that loving voice of his when I can't sleep at night, as if the stories could go on and continue to carry us long after our people are gone.
It's beautiful. I can smell the fire, Naomi.
Thank you. And Danusha has such a gorgeous poem to read.
Shall I dive in? Oh, I got so lost in yours, Naomi. I wasn't even thinking about where my book was. Okay, but I hope I have it there. And that is the thing about storytelling. We can just lose ourselves. I think there's nothing we crave more than to hear a story. Nothing I can think of.
And while you're looking for your poem, may I mention, once when I was working in Japan, I've now mentioned Japan twice. I've only actually been there twice in my life, but I've worked in many different schools and situations there, and I love being there. Once I selected to go to a poetry reading by a poet I love very much, Shuntaro Tanikawa, which would be only presented that evening in Japanese. There was to be no translation. And some of the other teachers said to me, why are you going? And I said, because I'm just going to listen to his rhythms and cadences and see how he moves. And it was so marvelously instructive to be a listener to a language I don't speak at all and feel completely absorbed by the poems anyway.
I love that. Listening in a language we don't even understand.
Yeah, that was the title of the poem I wrote afterwards. Now, the truth is, I didn't know many of his poems because I had read translations. So, of course, I didn't know if that was the poem he was reading, because who would know?
Right. How would you know?
Yeah, but it was just so comforting to be there with his actual voice speaking.
Yeah, so much is carried just in the voice, and we don't have to know. You know, Casper was asking me at the beginning if I understand Dutch, because I'm part Dutch, my dad's Dutch. And I was like, well, I understand some of it, but don't speak it. But my grandmother and I didn't speak the same language.
Yeah,
but I loved, right, right. Yeah. It sort of didn't matter. I mean,
didn't matter at all.
It really didn't matter. I think that's so interesting. When you're a kid, you get what's happening.
You soak it up.
It speaks to what you were saying, Naomi, of how words shape the air, right? Yes. And there's more than words, of course. There's the love and the presence. There's so much, but you know, there's something that changes in the world around us when we experience that kind of love. Yeah. Danusha, will you read to us as well?
Okay.
Will you read Stone, or are you reading a different one for us?
I'm gonna read Stone. We talked about that a little bit in the green room. So I'll just dive in. Stone. And what am I doing here? On the side of a hill, at the ragged edge of the tree line, sheltered by conifer and bay, watching the wind lift softly the dry leaves of bamboo. I lie on the ground and let the sun fall across my back, as I've been doing for the past hour, listening to the distant traffic, to the calls of birds I cannot name. Once there was so much I thought I needed. Now all I know is that I want to get closer to it. The rocky slope, the orange petals of the nasturtium adorning the fence, the wind's sudden breath. Close enough that I can almost feel at night the slight pressure of the stars against my skin. Isn't this what the mystics meant when they spoke of forsaking the world, not to turn our backs to it, only to its elaborate plots, its complicated pleasures, in favor of the pine's long shadow, the slow song of the grass I'm always forgetting and remembering and forgetting. I want to leave something here in the rough dirt, a twig, a small stone, perhaps this poem, a reminder to begin again by listening carefully with the body's rapt attention. Remember? To this, to this.
Ay, ay, ay.
Oh,
So good.
we want to remember.
Yeah.
We want to remember. Right. I write to remind myself too.
Mm, mm. Thank you, Danusha.
Thank you.
Oh, I feel like this conversation would go on forever if it could. I'm so excited to hear you both just share the way in which your work is situated in your life. Like I think it's so easy when there's someone you admire from far away to kind of rarify them, or like, oh well, that person must live in constant remembrance, and as you say, it's this remembering and forgetting and remembering. And the way I think about what our spiritual lives might be about is that the courage to keep trying to remember, because we're always, at least in my life, we're always going to end up somewhere, and we need each other to keep coming back. We need the fireplace, we need the bird song, we need the walk in the forest to be able to help us remember. So I love the way you give that shape in your work. Thank you. I see lots of joy in the comment section as well. Thank you, Sadie. I see Gabby, Anjali, say wonderful, wonderful. Friends, let's turn to Moen. You both love this poet. You've chosen a poem to read together. And friends who are listening, I hope that you'll read it along with us too, in some way, perhaps on your screen, because in the breakout conversations that we'll do afterwards, we'll invite your thoughts on this poem too. So we can soak in this conversation, but also cultivate any reflections or insights or wonderings that might strike you as we read it. So perhaps, Alec, you can post the poem in the chat, and I'll hand it over to Danusha and Naomi to guide us through.
Danusha, how about if I read down to birds and then you read the rest?
Okay. I'm game.
I did look up the estuary because I knew that William would like it if we just made sure we knew what it was. And I felt I knew what it was. The tidal mouth of a large river where the tide meets the stream. So it's that movement place of convergence in the water. The estuary. By day, we pace the many decks of the stone boat, and at night, we are turned out in its high windows, like stars of another side. Taste our mouths. We are the salt of the earth. Salt is memory in storm and cloud. We sleep in fine rigging like riding birds.
Taste our fingers, each with its own commandment. Day or night, it is harder to know than we know, but longer. We are asleep over charts at running windows. We are asleep with compasses in our hands. And at the bow of the stone boat, the wave from the ends of the earth keeps breaking.
I do feel that William Merwin was always tuned in, listening wise, to a sense of time that was so uh, tangible right in front of him, but at the same time, big time, large time, timeless time, the time from before we were born, the time from after we go on. And I feel that inside this poem, that sense of the big time, the movement by day, at night, in memory, these phrases that give us the compasses in our hands, give us places to be, um, but always knowing there's a bigger, unnameable place
Mm.
where we really are. And he was so aware of that in his poems, don't you think, Danusha or Casper?
Yeah, I think he tended, I mean, you had a long friendship with him and know so much about his life and work. But I do think of his work as being about time as
Yeah.
its core. Like when I look at people, I think of what's their core irritant, the thing that troubles and stirs in them, and then the solace they tend to go to.
Yes.
And I've not thought through his solace, but I think somehow the irritant, they might be the same for him, that the irritant is something about living in time, and perhaps his solace is about this sort of daily time, the chronos time, being
Yes.
held in kairos time, this sort of sacred timelessness. That
Yes.
seems to be the solace in his work. And it's so particular because I feel it's so present, poem after poem after poem. What is it to live in time? What is time? It's like a question mark in the middle of the poems. I'm looking at the chat too.
Yes.
Our finger.
Well, it is in his poem, Thanks. And that's such a great poem. And if you hear him read, and I keep urging people who never heard him to go to YouTube and listen to long ago readings of his, which you can find, and then much later readings of his. And I think somehow the ways in which he shared his own poems, and by the way, he loved to speak other people's poems. He had so many committed to memory, and he would just out of the blue start saying other people's poems from top to bottom. But he had such a beautiful voice and such a way of giving a poem as if it was held there in time, but in the timeless space. And I always felt that his impulse to abandon punctuation early on was related to this idea of wanting the poem to rise up into larger time and not be bound by those little petticoats of periods and dashes and semicolons and all the little uh, bits of punctuation that can appear also in a poem. But his voice was a captivating invitation to a different kind of listening, I think. And he was quite vigilant about how he used his own time, very committed to that early morning practice of writing, very quiet, silent. People knew that you didn't try to speak to him in the morning if he was at home. And also vigilant to his daily meditation practice and his zendo. And so he would tend to those times of day with deepest care and discipline. And somehow those times helped root him, I think, in this vast time of all literature and earlier poets that he lived within. He really cared about voices from other eras and voices that had not been heard enough in our time. The translations he did of people like Roberto Foros or Muso Soseki, people from other cultures, other places, other times in history. Those were so, so important to him.
Mm. There's something in what you're saying, just describing his life, his dailiness, that makes me think how important it is to listen to our lives.
Yes.
And in listening to our own lives, somehow we can come to that place of here's what matters. And maybe it's, I need to be silent all
Yes.
morning. And that's what's true. And then how do we create that space? And do we act on those things that we know to be true?
Right.
And so I think when we encounter people, we tend to look to the people around us to learn about how to live, how to be alive on earth. And so I love that we can, just in hearing you talk about that, learn something from his example of here's a way to be on earth. It's like eavesdropping on his life a little through you and his routines, and going, well, maybe I need to honor that.
Yeah.
Silence,
And if we feel there's something in our own lives that sometimes is getting in our way, like I'm definitely a person, I feel shame to admit it, but it's a fact, so I may as well admit it. I talk too much. I know I talk too much. I've always talked too much, and I want to talk less. And so to remind myself to listen is, it's not just a chastening device. It's like you really need to do this. You've lived a long time already and you still talk too much. So you really need to cut. And I think that to be playful with ourselves too in our disciplines. I really love how the Dalai Lama says that a discipline is simply a protection of one's own needs and space and creativity. And discipline is simply a protection of your own interests. Excuse me, because that's not the way we usually think of discipline.
That's right. Protection of one's own interests.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
See, my cough came. Say you do talk too much.
Well, the problem is we all really want to hear what you have to say. And so, part of your mission in life involves the talking. So what are you going to do?
No, I want to hear what you have to say, what Casper has to say.
Yeah, let's hear what Casper has.
But one thing I feel in this poem, The Estuary, is the chant impulse toward the end in those lines. We are asleep over charts at running windows. We are asleep with compasses in our hands. And sometimes not. Sometimes we are asleep and we're really feeling lost. But that impulse to create a chant, to live by or help shape our time was, I think, a very generous impulse on William's, his instinct to want to have a necessary suggestion.
Yeah. I love that so much, that chant in time, because it immediately reminds me of one of the practices in my life that kind of started as a joke, but has ended up being really fruitful, which is I keep a tech Sabbath on Friday night. So I turn off my phone and my laptop, but I always say literally out loud to myself, and then I started just putting it on social media, the work is not done, but it is time to stop. And it just having the words to say in that specific moment of time, it gives me like a little bridge, to enter from one time into a different time, from one way of being into another. Now, is it a perfect practice? No, but I love that. I don't even want to say it's like casting a spell, but it's a resource that there's something. The air changes when I say those words, and that's what I think poems can do. Is when we learn them off by heart, or we learn a chant by heart, or we learn a song by heart, they can be tools that help us change the air around us, that help us move from one time to another. And so many of us, I think, live lives of poetic poverty. Is that a phrase I can use? But just
Wow.
we should all have a poem in our hearts that we can say at any moment if we need comfort or if we need, joy. Yeah, anyway, much more to say on that, but I'm really connecting with that idea of time and the kind of these words that we can, these chants that we can say.
Yeah.
And I love that you've created that discipline for yourself. Um, the tech Sabbath. I mean, I think it's good to have a tech break every morning when you're doing your writing, although we surely won't tomorrow. We'll probably be tuning in all day. But it's often good to give yourself that tech-free time. William wouldn't use it at all. He didn't even want to talk on the telephone.
Really?
No, I mean
Letters? He did letters
like
then?
handwritten letters. Yeah.
Yeah.
But he never. I don't think he ever used a computer, ever.
Wow.
Yeah.
Just lots
And
of junk mail. Yeah.
lots of junk mail envelopes. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I want to make sure that we give our wonderful friends who've been listening a chance to ponder and to ask a question also. And I know we'll have just about 15 minutes for this, and we'll say goodbye to Danusha and Naomi, and then we'll have a chance to talk more in our small groups. But if you have a reflection or a question for Danusha and Naomi about the art of listening or their work, please raise your digital hand, and I'll shout out your name and bring you onto the digital stage, as it were. And I can assure you, Danusha and Naomi, that we have only the most wonderful people here. So whoever it is who wants to ask a question will be thrilled to hear from you. So please feel free to raise your digital hand. Maybe it's a little stage fright. Oh, Hannah says, I can't figure out how to raise my hand. But if you go to the bottom, there should be, let's see, next to under reactions, there's a little button that says raise your hand, which Kimberly has beautifully illustrated for us. So I'm going to invite Kimberly on to join us, and just unmute yourself and fire away.
Yeah, and I am nervous. So I'm always endlessly interested in the creative process. And I'm just thinking about the art of listening and the idea that listening is a magnetic creative force. The friends that really truly listen to us, we move toward. I'm curious if you think that in your process, the words find you, or how does that work for you in terms of like giving voice to the things that you're hearing?
That's such a beautiful question. I love what you said, Kimberly, about we're drawn to the friends who really listen. That's so true. I do think the words find you, but you have to make yourself an available space for them to come in. And I find by walking, often going out and walking, they start coming to me if I'm in a very a swirling time inside my head or involved in too many thoughts or distractions. To go take a walk will often bring me back to a rhythm and a place where I could come home, sit down, and let the words find me. But Danusha, you feel that too, that the words find you, don't you?
I do. They kind of seek you out. And I think of Lucille Clifton, who would say, I like to make myself available to the poem.
Yes.
And I love that idea. It's in setting aside time during the day when I know I'm going to sit and kind of be attentive, eavesdropping on my thoughts, or as you say, going on a walk, or it could be I just call it all puttering in the garden, puttering with the laundry. All of the things that fall under puttering seem to be some of the best things for receiving lines. I don't really do a thing where I stare at a blank page and worry over it. I don't think that's any fun. So once I have a line kind of swimming, I'll sit and write it down, or I'll sit and read other people's work. And then you can't help but write something in response.
Oh, I love everything you said. And also, Kimberly, a way that I feel we invite the words sometimes is simply writing a list of questions, the questions we're carrying at that moment that are unspeakably difficult or unanswerable or easily answerable. It doesn't matter what kinds of questions, just writing some that you have with you at that moment, and we always have some, and then letting them invite words, further words, so you don't have that blank page experience.
Thank you, Kimberly. Yeah, I love what you're saying, Danusha, about that, the practice of reading other people, because I was reflecting on this today of, I got to go to the theater over the weekend, which made me feel inspired about this. And now I get to create that, and that moved someone else. And it's like we're passing on, this golden sacred hot potato to each other. Like you get it for a moment, you get it for a moment. Yeah, and hopefully we're around to catch it. But I love that. I love that, Midge. Hannah, will you join us? What's your question?
A question might form as I put together 3 different things that all 3 of you have said. Danusha, what you were saying about like letting something unexpected happen and making like a neutral space so something can come to us, like resonated with an aspect of my spirituality, which comes from Shintoism, which is like the very practical thing of going to a physical place of a shrine to pray and getting a physical object of a charm to remind you of this thing that you specifically prayed for, like peace in your relationship. And then because you have this thing constantly in front of you, you're constantly reminded to make space for peace to be in your relationship. And then you find it. When it comes to you, you grab it because you're looking for it. And if you're not making space for it, then you can't grab it. And then, Naomi, you started talking about Japan. And I was like, well, this all fits together, I guess. And then, Casper, when you were talking about your tech Sabbath, that's kind of not necessarily even making space for something as much as it is like, I know something is here and I'm going to carve the space. I don't just have to like say, a space. It's like sometimes you have to push things out of the way to make the space. Yes, like a fighting thing. So I connected some things, and that's all I really wanted to say.
Beautiful. So nice.
Hannah, you've always got a gift of synthesizing. I love that. I love seeing those threads be woven together. Thank you for that.
And I love the idea of holding an object in a place of prayer or meditation. Beautiful, Hannah.
Thank you, Hannah. I'll invite any other folks who want to raise their digital hand to join us. But I also want to just ask, how does your creative work sit next to or within your spiritual lives, if that's a word that you use? I don't know if that is, because so often when we love something, and perhaps when we're good at something and we turn it into a job and we might get paid for it, very quickly there's a different dynamic that appears, and I'm curious, how do you hold those two things together, if at all, or do they sit quite separately in your own lives?
I love that question, and I can't wait to hear what Naomi says to this too. I
wanted you
curious too, so I'm happy to go first. I'm just also curious, but I think for me, it's at the core of that kind of practice, in that it's the place I take all the questions and the things I don't know. It's a place. The writing practice is for me a place for uncertainty and just for not knowing. And I think for that reason, I consider it a kind of spiritual practice. I don't like to put too heavy a mantle on anything, but it helps me. So much of today is talking about spaces and attending to space, that, like Naomi said, the space after the poem has been read. And you talking about creating that space for the Sabbath. So I guess it's sort of the time I spend reading other people's poems, writing my own, is a space for uncertainty. And I love being able to attend to my not knowing. I think that's the closest thing I have to an answer. So thank you for asking that.
It is so beautiful. And I love what Shelby wrote in the chat about, I would argue that if we invite something unexpected to happen, our response is or becomes not a neutral posture, but an open receiving one. And I think this also goes back to the estuary, the tidal mouth of a large river, where there's a tide and that tide is ever changing. And that river is accommodating it, but open to it and welcoming it when it comes. And um, it's a continual movement, but I agree and underscore every word that Danusha said. Fresh water meets salt water. Spiritual practice meets writing practice. They flow together. They miss each other. I mean, I think sometimes when we're lonely for that deep self, lonely for something to carry us forward with meaning and movement, we're needing that time and that acknowledged time of convergence.
I love that. I wonder, because I think we might have time, if you would bless us with another poem as we close.
Sure.
I'm putting you on the spot here a little bit, so I'll give you a moment to find the page.
Well, I have a very short one, so I'll read it first while Danusha picks hers. I would pick all of hers.
I would pick all of yours.
All of our friends around this beautiful, intangible table to read Danusha's books because they are so wonderful. And I'm reading a poem called Messages from Everywhere, which really came from a book I did years ago for like girls around the age of 12, but it relates to this topic. Messages from everywhere light up our backyard. A bird that flew 5,000 miles is trilling 6 bright notes. This bird flew over mountains and valleys and tiny dolls and pencils of children I will never see. Because this bird is singing to me, I belong to the wide wind, the people far away who share the air and the clouds. Together, we are looking up into all we do not own, and we are listening.
Oh, Naomi, that's just so beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you,
That's
my friends.
so lovely. Oh my goodness.
Such a simple poem, but what we do.
We do. I'm dropping things on the ground around me. I'm going to read a short poem as well in closing. And I just want to again thank everybody for just attending so deeply. I can feel you. I feel your attention, even across these invisible waves. So that's some strange magic too, isn't it? That we get to do this. I saw all the roll call and I'm always just touched by how we can come together in these ways. So thank you for being here. And I'm going to read a little poem that I was asked to write for a waiting room. And somehow the things that came up today reminded me of waiting and being in those in-between spaces and not knowing. So yeah, this is now on the waiting room of a medical facility on the wall. And it's called Let Rain Be Rain. Let rain be rain. Let wind be wind. Let the small stone be the small stone. May the bird rest on its branch, the beetle in its burrow. May the pine tree lay down its needles, the rock rose its petals. It's early. or it's late. The answers to our questions lie hidden in acorn, oyster, the seagull's speckled egg. We've come this far already. Why not let breath be breath, salt be salt? How faithful the tide that has carried us, that carries us now out to sea and back.
How faithful the tide indeed into the estuary and into this conversation. Thank you so much, Naomi. Thank you so much, Danusha. What an absolute privilege. I want to just remove our spotlight so we can see everyone to say a big thank you to, oh gosh, how do I do that for myself? There we go. There we go.
Casper, thank you so much, Casper, for hosting us. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, Danusha. Thank you, Naomi.
Sweet and gorgeous space. Thank you so much, Casper.
Beautiful. Bye.